The town square baked under the weight of the midday sun, its dust swirling with every boot step and horse's snort. A makeshift platform had been built in front of the courthouse, nothing more than a wagon with its planks stripped bare. Upon it stood a woman and her little girl, their clothes threadbare, their faces pale from hunger and humiliation. The widow's hands clutched her daughter's shoulders so tightly, it seemed she feared the world might tear her away. The banker barked out the terms, waving a paper that named the debt her late husband had left behind. "She cannot pay," he declared, "so the law allows her labor to be sold until the debt is cleared." The crowd leaned in, hungry for spectacle, some smirking, others muttering judgment. To them it was no different than a cattle sale. The widow kept her eyes lowered, shame burning her cheeks. Her daughter, no more than 8, pressed close to her side, eyes wide and unblinking as she scanned the restless faces around them. A child shouldn't have had such a steady, piercing gaze, but hers cut deeper than words. The banker called for bids. Silence at first, broken by a cruel laugh. "Not worth the trouble," someone shouted. "Best leave her to the desert," another jeered. The widow's body stiffened, but she said nothing. Then a figure shifted at the edge of the crowd. A tall cowboy, his hat shadowing a face carved with silence and solitude, stepped forward. He was known to the townsfolk as a man of few words, a drifter who kept to his ranch outside of town, the kind who had buried his past so deep no one dared to ask. When he spoke, his voice was steady but quiet. "I'll pay." The crowd turned, stunned. "How much?" The banker sneered. The cowboy reached into his pocket and laid a few coins on the crate before him, barely enough to buy a sack of flour. The crowd erupted with laughter. "Pennies. That's all she's worth. Cheap man for a cheap woman." The cowboy didn't answer. His gaze wasn't on them, nor even on the widow. His eyes lingered on the little girl, who stared back at him with that same unwavering gaze, as though she could see through his silence to the hollow ache inside. The banker grumbled, but snatched the coins, eager to be rid of the business. "She's yours," the cowboy extended a hand. The widow hesitated, shame and disbelief flickering across her face. But when her daughter's small fingers curled into hers, she stepped down from the wagon. Through the jeers and mocking laughter, the cowboy led them away. His shoulders were unbent, his stride unshaken, while behind them the crowd's cruel amusement carried on the wind. But for the first time in years, something unspoken had shifted in his silence. The journey to his ranch was made in silence. The widow kept her eyes low, walking beside the cowboy's horse while her daughter's small hand gripped hers so tightly it left faint crescents in her skin. To be led away by a stranger was frightening enough, but to be bought, humiliating. She expected chains of a different kind to greet her when they reached his land. Yet when they arrived, the ranch was quiet, almost lonely. A few horses grazed lazily near the fence, and the lowing of cattle drifted through the evening air. The cowboy dismounted and opened the door to his modest home without ceremony. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and stew lingered faintly. He didn't issue orders, nor did he demand labor. Instead, he placed blankets on the table, set out bread and beans, and then stepped back, as though giving them the choice to accept or refuse. His silence filled the room more than words could. The widow hesitated, suspicion sharpening her features. Was this kindness a mask? Her daughter tugged at her skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry." The words were soft, almost apologetic. With a reluctant nod, the widow guided her to sit, and together they ate. The cowboy didn't join them. He busied himself with the fire, adding logs and adjusting the kettle, as though content just to give them warmth. Still, the widow's pride gnawed at her. Each bite of food felt like a debt. Every glance toward him reminded her of the coins exchanged for her dignity. She had been forced into a transaction she hadn't chosen, and now she waited for the moment he'd reveal the price he truly expected. That night, as the house settled into quiet, she lay awake on the makeshift bed he'd arranged in the corner. The cowboy's steady footsteps faded outside, leaving only the rustle of night wind. Beside her, her daughter's small voice whispered into the darkness, "Please, God, don't let him be mean. Don't let him send us away. Please make Mama smile again." The widow's throat tightened, but she stayed silent, her hand brushing gently through her daughter's hair until the child drifted to sleep. Unbeknownst to her, The cowboy had paused by the window, her daughter's prayer carrying clearly into the night air. For a man who had long buried his heart beneath layers of silence, those words stirred something restless, something he thought he had lost forever. By morning, whispers had already spread through town. The cowboy bought himself a family. Some laughed, others sneered, and still others shook their heads in disbelief. But at the ranch, the truth was quieter. 2 strangers and a child, bound not by coin, but by a fragile thread of hope neither dared name. Life at the ranch began to settle into a rhythm neither the widow nor her daughter had expected. Mornings carried the scent of fresh hay and the sound of hooves against packed dirt. The widow helped with simple chores, fetching water, sweeping the porch, preparing meals. At first she did so out of obligation, telling herself it was repayment for his purchase. But gradually she noticed something unsettling in its simplicity. He never asked, never demanded. He simply worked alongside her, silent but steady. Her daughter, once shadowed by fear, began to brighten in the wide spaces of the ranch. She laughed when the old sheepdog loped clumsily after her, tail wagging as she darted across the yard. She squealed when chickens scattered at her chase, feathers flying in disarray. The cowboy would pause at his tasks, his lips tugging at the ghost of a smile, though he quickly masked it beneath his stoic calm. The widow watched these small shifts with guarded eyes. Could it be true? Was he not cruel at all, but only distant? She had met men who wielded silence like a whip, but his was different. His quiet seemed less about control and more about pain. One evening, after supper, the little girl settled cross-legged near the fire, her eyes fixed boldly on the cowboy as he mended tack. "Why don't you ever talk?" she asked, her voice innocent but direct. The question hung heavy in the room. The widow's heart lurched, afraid he'd be angered. But instead his hand stilled, the leather strap dangling loose. For a long moment only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough as gravel. "I used to." The child tilted her head. "What happened?" His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, flicked to the firelight. "I lost my wife. My boy, too, talking. Didn't bring them back." The widow's breath caught, her chest tightening with an ache that wasn't her own. She had braced herself to see him only as the man who had bought her freedom, another oppressor wearing a different face. But in that moment she saw more clearly, a broken man who carried grief like a chain he couldn't lay down. Her daughter, unburdened by the weight of adult sorrow, simply shuffled closer and leaned against his leg. The cowboy didn't move away. His silence wasn't shattered, but it softened. And for the first time since stepping off that auction block, the widow felt the faint stirrings of something unexpected. Trust. Word traveled fast across the prairie. By the week's end, every corner of town buzzed with the same tale. The cowboy bought himself a widow and her brat for pennies. Some laughed, others sneered, and many whispered that no good could come of it. The banker, furious that his spectacle had turned into something beyond his control, fanned the flames with venom. She tricked him, he spat to anyone who'd listen. A schemer selling pity for coin. Worthless, both of them. When the cowboy finally rode into town for supplies, the whispers boiled into a confrontation. The widow had insisted on coming, her daughter clinging to her skirts. She wanted to hold her head high, though shame knotted her stomach. It happened in the square, the very place she had been humiliated weeks before. The banker stepped forward, voice booming for all to hear. "There she is. A woman sold for pennies, and that's all she'll ever be." "Pennies!" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "He paid too much!" Another added, "What man would waste even that?" The widow's cheeks burned hot, her daughter burying her face in her dress. For a moment, dread clawed at her. Would the cowboy bow his head and walk away, abandoning them to the scorn? Instead, he stepped forward. His voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the jeers. "Enough!" The crowd quieted, unsettled by the weight behind that single word. The cowboy's gaze locked on the banker. "You measure worth in coins. I measure it in courage, in loyalty, in love. And by those measures, she's beyond price." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some scoffed, but others shifted uneasily, shame tugging at their bravado. The banker's face twisted, fury lighting his eyes. "You'll regret this. Both of you. I'll see your land stripped, your name dragged through the mud." The widow clutched her daughter tighter, heart pounding. Yet when she looked at the cowboy, standing firm, shoulders squared, shielding them from the weight of the town, she felt something unfamiliar rise inside her. Not fear, not shame, but the faintest spark of pride. The banker's voice echoed as he stormed off, "I'll ruin you both." But in the hush that followed, it was the cowboy's presence beside her that lingered louder than any threat. The banker returned like a storm, his words sharp as the crack of a whip. He cornered them again in the heart of town, this time with papers in hand and venom on his tongue. "The debt still stands," he sneered. "She was sold cheap, but I'll have my repayment in other ways. A woman who costs pennies owes more than she can pay." His cruel laughter stirred the townsfolk, drawing a restless crowd. The widow's hands trembled where they clutched her daughter's shoulders. Old shame surged through her veins, dragging her back to the auction block, to the sneers, to the feeling of being nothing but a commodity. She braced for humiliation, but the cowboy stepped forward, calm yet unyielding, his presence like a wall between them and the banker. "No," he said, voice steady, carrying across the square. "You'll take nothing more from her." The banker's smirk widened. "And what gives you the right to say so?" The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers, holding them high enough for all to see. "This," he said simply. The crowd hushed as he handed the papers to the widow. With shaking fingers, she unfolded them. Her eyes scanned the words, disbelief flooding her features. It was a deed, legal, binding, part of his land signed over into her name. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The same townsfolk who had mocked her as worthless now gaped in stunned silence. Whispers broke like wind in the prairie grass. He gave her land. Made her his equal? The widow's knees weakened and she fell against her daughter, tears spilling freely. Not of shame this time, but of release, of a weight finally lifted. She clutched the girl to her chest, sobbing into her hair. The cowboy's voice broke through the quiet. Not loud, but certain. "Stay," he said, turning to her. "Not because you owe me. Not because of pity. Stay because this land is yours now. And because I'd have you as my wife if your heart allows." The widow's tears blurred everything, but through them she saw the truth in his face. Not a buyer, not a savior. A man who had given her more than she ever thought possible. Dignity. Choice and love without condition. Her daughter darted forward, wrapping both arms around the cowboy and her mother at once, burying herself between them. The crowd, once jeering, stood hushed, bearing witness not to a bargain but to a bond sealed in courage. The banker's fury twisted his face, but his threats fell hollow in the air. For in that moment, before the entire town, the widow and her daughter were no longer possessions but family, claimed not by coin, but by the heart. The wedding was as plain and honest as the land itself. No gilded halls, no grand procession, just the preacher standing beneath the wide prairie sky, his Bible open, the sun casting long golden rays across the fields. Ranch hands gathered nearby, men hardened by labor but softened by the sight before them. A handful of townsfolk, those who carried kindness rather than scorn, stood respectfully at a distance. The widow, once bowed by shame, now stood tall beside the cowboy, her dress simple but glowing in the light. Her daughter clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered that morning, grinning proudly as though she herself were part of the ceremony. From a hilltop, the banker watched with a face twisted by bitterness. His threats had turned to dust, his power stripped away. The land, the woman, the story, none of it bent to his will anymore. He was left only with the sour taste of defeat. Life after that day flowed with a new kind of rhythm. The widow, no longer a widow but a wife, worked side by side with her husband, tending cattle, cooking meals, stitching the fabric of a home from the tatters of what once was despair. The ranch that had felt empty now pulsed with laughter and warmth. One afternoon, as the cowboy lifted the little girl into the saddle, she looked at him with bright eyes and said, clear as a bell, "Thank you." "Pa." The word struck him harder than any bullet could. For a heartbeat, his breath caught. Then from deep within him, something long buried broke free, a laugh rich and unguarded, carried on the wind. And so it was that the man who had lived in silence now lived in joy. The final image was of the three of them riding across the golden fields at sunset, the horizon stretching endless and open, not bound by bargain or coin, but by love and choice. He bought her for pennies, but it was her daughter's eyes that made him rich beyond measure.